This year, 2026, for those of you watching this video having discovered it on a hard drive pulled from the rubble of my civilization post-apocalypse, hi, is the 60th anniversary of Star Trek, which premiered on television in 1966. Everyone who knows anything about Star Trek knows that it was created by this guy, Gene Roddenberry, and that it reflects Roddenberry's optimistic and progressive vision of the future, a future where humanity has finally freed itself of ignorance and prejudice and greed and fear and taken to the stars to explore the galaxy alongside a wondrous variety of alien species who all mostly just look like humans with shit glued to their faces. It's truly inspiring. But, and I'm sorry if this comes as a shock to any of you, Gene Roddenberry didn't make Star Trek all by himself. Yes, obviously he collaborated with actors and directors and camera operators and lighting technicians and set designers and special effects artists and the many other talented and hardworking people who he needed to help bring his vision to life, but he also collaborated with other writers who not only served Roddenberry's vision, but added their own contributions to it. This raises a question. If Star Trek was not, and is not, purely the vision of Gene Roddenberry, whose vision is it? Or, to phrase it another way, Roddenberry may have created Star Trek, but who actually made Star Trek fly? There's a popular way of studying and understanding history called the Great Man Theory. Basically, Great Man Theory presents history as the result of the actions of a few outstanding individuals, heads of state, military leaders, heroes. For example, when I studied the American Civil War in middle school, and again in high school, and again in college, I grew up half an hour from Antietam Battlefield. We studied the Civil War a lot. We learned about Abraham Lincoln, and about General Ulysses S. Grant and Colonel Robert E. Lee, and about General William Tecumseh Sherman and what he was up to. And we learned about other remarkable people who weren't directly involved in the fighting of the war, but who had something to do with it, like Frederick Douglass and John Brown. But we learned almost nothing about what life was like for the ordinary soldiers who actually marched out into those pastures and cornfields and fought the war. And we learned even less about what life was like for those living in the United States during the war who weren't fighting in it. We didn't even learn that much about the junior officers who served under the likes of General Grant and General Sherman and helped them formulate and carry out their plans of attack. Great Man Theory has fallen out of fashion in recent years in favor of more nuanced and inclusive approaches, which is a good thing, I think. Great Man Theory has the advantage of providing us with a relatively simple and easy to understand narrative, but that narrative is incomplete because it minimizes or erases important contributions from lesser people. If you care about finding out what really happened in the past, Great Man Theory ain't going to do it for you. The popular understanding of the history of Star Trek has been significantly shaped by Great Man Theory. Even today, 35 years after his death, Star Trek is still regularly spoken of as Gene Roddenberry's vision, as though he was the only person who had anything to do with it. My purpose here isn't to minimize Roddenberry's contribution. He did create the show. He did create most of the important regular characters that were part of Star Trek during his lifetime. And most importantly of all, he established from the very beginning that Star Trek would be a vehicle for social commentary and that it would unapologetically present diversity, equality, and inclusion as good things to be embraced and celebrated and as sources of strength. Regardless of whatever else I say about him through the course of this video, I want to state this as plainly as I can. Star Trek would not exist and would not be what it is without Gene Roddenberry. However, there are many qualities which we associate with Star Trek, and I'm talking here specifically about the original series, qualities which also play an important part in making Star Trek what it is, which did not come from Roddenberry. There were two writers other than Roddenberry who worked on Star Trek who were at least as important to the development of the show's personality. One was Dorothy D.C. Fontana, who, in addition to serving as story editor for the end of the first and most of the second seasons, wrote some of the best remembered episodes of the original series, including Charlie X, Tomorrow is Yesterday, This Side of Paradise, and Journey to Babel. Did uncredited rewrites to many more episodes, including The City on the Edge of Forever, and probably did more than any other single writer to develop the character of Spock. Fontana's impact on Star Trek continues to be immense, but I did a video about her several years ago, which I would recommend you go check out if you want to hear more of what I think about the great Dorothy Fontana. For this video, I want to focus on another writer. His name was Gene Coon. There he is! There aren't that many pictures of him, so you're probably going to see that one a lot. Before Star Trek, Gene Coon's biggest job as a TV writer was on Wagon Train. In fact, going by time spent and number of episodes written, his biggest job, period, as a TV writer was on Wagon Train, on which he wrote 23 episodes across 6 seasons. Gene Roddenberry would later reference this show in his original pitch for Star Trek, where he summarized his concept as Wagon Train to the Stars. Gene Coon joined Star Trek as a producer in 1966, with production already well underway on the first season. The first episode on which he's credited as a producer is Miri, the 11th episode produced and the 8th to be broadcast. In addition to producing and making uncredited rewrites to scripts, he also took a pass at The City on the Edge of Forever. Coon is a credited writer on 13 Star Trek episodes. Well, technically, Gene Coon is a credited writer on 9 episodes. After leaving the show as a producer in Season 2, he worked on 4 scripts in Season 3 under the pseudonym Lee Cronin. While he was a producer on the show, Coon was as important to the day-to-day production of Star Trek as Roddenberry himself. And when it came to setting the tone of the show itself, he was arguably even more important. When Trekkies talk about Coon's contributions to Star Trek, we often fixate on what he added to the fictional universe in which the show takes place. For example, Coon wrote the episode Errand of Mercy, which introduced the Klingons, who would go on to become the signature antagonists of the entire franchise. He established that the service of which the Starship Enterprise and its crew were part was called Starfleet, and that the government which operated Starfleet was called the Federation. He wrote the episode Space Seed, which introduces Khan Noonien Singh, and Metamorphosis, which introduces the inventor of warp drive on Earth, Zephram Cochrane, and The Return of the Archons, which is the first episode to mention the Prime Directive. And all of that stuff, that world building, if you will, though I've come to quite dislike that term, matters, because each of those individual contributions, along with those made by many other storytellers through the years, adds up to make Star Trek what it is, to give it the unique texture that it has, for better and for worse. But a lot of it is mere window dressing. If Starfleet hadn't been called Starfleet, if it had been given some other name, the truly meaningful content of the stories would remain the same. Only the superficial aspects would be different. For me, the most important legacy Gene Coon left to Star Trek is found in its characters and its tone. Coon didn't create any of the major characters. All the regulars were already in place by the time he got there, except for Chekhov, who wasn't added until Season 2. But he was responsible more than any other single member of the creative team for establishing their personalities and relationships to one another. This was especially true of the 3 most important characters in the show, Captain Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy. It was Coon who established the primacy of the big 3 of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy in the ensemble. Kirk and Spock were already solidly in place as the lead and second lead, respectively, and McCoy was obviously going to be an important character from his debut appearance. He figures very prominently in The Man Trap, the first episode ever broadcast, but Coon cemented the close friendships between the 3 men and the nature of their chemistry with one another. I can imagine Star Trek without the government they work for being called the Federation, or the fleet they serve in being called Starfleet. I can imagine a version of Star Trek where we never learn which human invented warp drive, much less meet him. But I find it really difficult to imagine Star Trek without that central dynamic between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. The bond between those three characters is the heart of the show, and the friction between them, especially between Spock and McCoy, is central to the show's identity. The first episode on which Gene Coon was the credited writer was Arena, the 18th episode broadcast. The opening scene includes an exchange that's typical of the energy between Spock/McCoy. Spock finds it curious when the Commodore in charge of an outpost they've come to see insists that the away team include tactical personnel when it's just supposed to be a friendly visit. McCoy chalks it up to the Commodore's well-known hospitality and shares how eager he is to eat a meal cooked by the Commodore's personal chef instead of the reconstituted rations they typically get on the Enterprise. Spock, annoyed at his concerns being waved off so casually, says disparagingly, "Doctor, you are a sensualist." To which McCoy replies proudly, "You bet your pointed ears I am." Spock being led by his brain, McCoy being led by his heart, or his stomach in this case. Spock insulting McCoy for prioritizing his emotions over logic, McCoy taking the insult as a compliment. All the basics of the Spock-McCoy relationship are there in that brief bit of dialogue. And it gets better as the episode progresses. When Captain Kirk is abruptly taken from the Enterprise to do battle one-on-one against the captain of a Gorn ship, Spock and McCoy are left behind to watch the fight, which is being transmitted to the view screen by Kirk and the Gorn's alien abductors. First, McCoy demands to know what Spock is going to do to get Kirk back. Since they don't know how Kirk was taken or even where he was taken to, Spock's answer is basically, "I'm gonna wait, because there ain't shit else I can do." That's not good enough for McCoy, who's like, "Your logic ain't such hot shit now, is it, Mr. Spock? Where's the captain?" They watch on the view screen as Kirk first evades, then fights, then uses his head and constructs a crude weapon from available materials, and the vibe is very much that of two people watching a movie where the one keeps asking the other what's happening. McCoy's like, "What's he doing?" And Spock's like, "He found some diamonds. He's going to use them as projectiles." Projectiles? How? "It looks like he's mixing potassium nitrate with sulfur and charcoal." "What's that gonna do?" "Will you just watch?" The withering banter between Spock and McCoy was clearly one of Coon's favorite things to write because it's all through his episodes, the ones he produced and the ones he wrote himself. Among my favorite episodes for Spock and McCoy scenes is Bread and Circuses, the one where the Enterprise visits a planet that is home to a civilization that is basically ancient Rome, but with TV. The episode begins with some typical arguing between Spock and McCoy to reestablish their relationship. Shortly after Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down, McCoy jokes that one of these days he'd like to beam down to a planet and declare himself to be the Archangel Gabriel. Spock's like, "I don't see how that's supposed to be funny." McCoy says, "You just don't get it because you'd never be mistaken for an angel with those pointed ears. Now, if you showed up somewhere carrying a pitchfork..." They hate each other so much. Only they don't, really. Coon enjoyed writing McCoy and Spock as adversaries, constantly sniping at one another, but Coon, like Roddenberry, was also a humanist, and he knew how important it was to remind the audience, every once in a while, that underneath all those snide remarks was genuine mutual respect. Later on, in Bread and Circuses, when the landing party has been captured and forced to take part in gladiatorial games, Spock and McCoy find themselves separated from Kirk and locked in a prison cell. They've just returned from a battle in the arena, where Spock saved McCoy's life. While Spock attempts to devise a means of escape, McCoy tries to thank him. "Listen, Spock," he says, "I know we've had our differences. Maybe they're jokes, maybe not. Like Jim says, maybe we don't even know ourselves. What I'm trying to say is, hey, I'm a little busy with trying to free us from this cell, so if you could come to a point. What I'm trying to say is, you saved my life out there." "Yes, that's correct." "I'm trying to say thank you, you pointed-eared hobgoblin." "Ah, well, racist insults of one's appearance are always a solid basis for expressing gratitude. I guess I'm supposed to say, you're welcome, but you need to understand something. I'm all about logic, man. I didn't save you because I like you. I saved you because you're the chief medical officer of our ship, and losing you would compromise efficiency. You're nothing more than a tool to me. A Band-Aid dispenser, that's all you are." "I love you too, man." I embellished a bit. You know how I do. But the actual scene is a great example of what made Gene Coon a great writer, and a great writer for Star Trek in particular. McCoy reaches out to Spock. Spock responds in his typically Spockian way, which causes McCoy to lash out, which causes Spock to get even more Spockish in response. But the end result is that both men end up vulnerable in front of each other, tacitly admitting in Spock's case, that they're going at each other because of the situation they're in, because they're worried about each other, and because they're worried about Kirk. Bread and Circuses was an important episode in Gene Coon's tenure on Star Trek. It was the last episode on which he was a credited writer under his own name. He's credited as a co-writer with Gene Roddenberry. By this time, the relationship between the two Genes had become fraught. They argued frequently over the tone of the show. See, Roddenberry was not a fan of Coon's lighter, more humorous take on Star Trek. He saw Star Trek as an inherently serious project, heavy with the significance of the many important things he, Gene Roddenberry, the great bird of the galaxy, had to say. This comes across in the episodes on which Roddenberry is the credited writer, particularly the two pilots, The Cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before. They're not bad episodes, but they're also not ones I would choose to represent the show at its best. And they're not exactly laugh riots either. Which is not to say that every Star Trek episode needs to be funny. It doesn't. In fact, if you look at the episodes on which Gene Coon is a credited writer, only one, A Piece of the Action, is an out-and-out comedy episode. Coon didn't write Star Trek as a comedy, but he did make the Starship Enterprise a more welcoming place. There's less military-style formality and more of a sense of comfort among the crew. It feels like these people know each other and like each other. There's friendly banter, quips, and chuckles. There's a chain of command. There's a hierarchy. These are highly trained professionals in a uniformed service, but they aren't soldiers. They're explorers, and they're out here on an adventure. Besides A Piece of the Action, which he wrote, Coon also produced two more comedy episodes in Season 2, The Trouble with Tribbles, written by David Gerrold, and I, Mud, written by Stephen Candle. Roddenberry was apparently not a fan of those episodes. I guess they didn't fit with his vision. The sad part about the conflict between the two Genes is, if Roddenberry could have seen beyond his narrow concept of what the show was, and seen past his own ego, he might have realized that Coon's interpretation of Star Trek was not in conflict with Roddenberry's vision. In the book The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield, which was published around the time Star Trek's third season premiered and was based on research Whitfield conducted during production of Season 2, Gene Coon is quoted at length describing his admiration for what Gene Roddenberry created. Quote, "Gene created a totally new universe. He invented a starship, which works, by the way, and is a logical progression from what we know today. He created customs, morals, modes of speaking, a complete technology. We have a very rigid technology on the show. We know how fast we can go. We know what we use for fuel. We know what our weapons will do. And Gene invented all these things. He did a monumental job of creation. He created an entire galaxy and an entire rule book for operating within that galaxy with very specific laws governing behavior, manners, customs, as well as science and technology. Now that's a hell of a job. He didn't create a show, he created a universe. And it works well. This was a massive, titanic job of creation, one of the most impressive feats of its kind that I've ever seen. You can submit our ship or our technology or anything you want to NASA, and they will say, well, it's pretty far out, but I don't see why it shouldn't work. Nobody can tell us that it's scientifically impossible or that it won't work. Gene Coon loved Gene Roddenberry's vision. He just wanted to present it in such a way that the audience could love it too. And he did that by populating it with interesting and likable characters who, while more tolerant and socially evolved than present-day people, were still recognizable as human beings. Coon's version of Star Trek may have been too comedic for Roddenberry's taste, but Coon never forgot the deeper purpose behind Star Trek, the humanist, inclusive, socially conscious message it was created to send. The episodes on which Coon himself is a credited writer contain some of the show's most pointed social and political commentary. In Arena, it's suggested that the Gorn only carried out a massacre on a Federation outpost because that outpost had been placed in their territory. Is it possible we're in the wrong? McCoy asks. Were the Gorn merely protecting themselves? In Errand of Mercy, both the Klingon Empire and the Federation are brought up short by the Organians for being violent and warlike. In The Devil in the Dark, the Horta, initially thought to be a murderous monster that must be destroyed, is revealed to be an intelligent and sensitive creature that was merely defending its young from human encroachment. Even in his more lighthearted episodes, Coon took the trouble to shade in some depth. In a piece of the action, it's revealed that the gangster-themed civilization is the product of careless cultural pollution on the part of visiting human explorers. Over and over again in episodes produced during Coon's tenure as writer and producer, the message of tolerance, acceptance, and responsibility is reiterated. Apparently evil enemies are revealed to be misunderstood, or to have more in common with our heroes than our heroes might want to admit, and human ignorance and carelessness is shown to be the cause of more than a few troubles. Nevertheless, the relationship between Roddenberry and Coon, which had grown more and more contentious throughout Coon's time on the show, reached a breaking point midway through season 2. Perhaps it was working with Roddenberry on writing Bread and Circuses. Perhaps it was something else. I don't know what the last straw was. Gene Coon never said. In The Making of Star Trek, which was written with the show's cooperation and on which Gene Roddenberry holds a purely honorary co-author credit, Stephen Whitfield downplays any behind-the-scenes drama, describing Coon's exit from the show this way. Quote, "About midway through the second season, Gene Coon departed the fold. Coon was brought in as producer after Roddenberry was satisfied he had firmly established the series format during the first 13 or 14 episodes. As a tremendously creative writer, Coon had done his job well. Producer on Star Trek is no easy task, and demands more than most are willing to give. But after almost a year as producer, he wanted a change of pace." I suspect the truth of the matter was more complex and less harmonious. The workload was a lot to handle, but so were the creative battles with Roddenberry. And Coon's heavy smoking habit and tumultuous personal life, he divorced his first wife and married his second while the show was in production, didn't help matters either, I'm sure. He left Star Trek to take a job as a writer-producer on It Takes a Thief, and this, as far as I've been able to find out, is the reason he used the pseudonym Lee Cronin on the 4 scripts he worked on in Season 3 of Star Trek. The job on It Takes a Thief was under an exclusive contract, which prevented him from working on any other shows. But as a condition of his release from his contract on Star Trek, Coon promised Roddenberry to continue writing for the show. So he did, under a pseudonym. The first script he contributed under the name Lee Cronin was the Season 3 premiere Spock's Brain, which to this day is still cited as one of the worst episodes ever produced by any Star Trek series. Maybe it was exhaustion or indifference, but I like to think it was Gene Coon's revenge. His way of saying to Roddenberry, "You want me to keep writing for your show? Here you go." 5 years after he left Star Trek, in 1973, Gene Coon died. Lung cancer. That smoking habit, you know. He was 49 years old. In the book, Inside Star Trek, The Real Story, co-authors Herb Solow and Bob Justman, who worked on Star Trek from the beginning and collaborated closely with Gene Roddenberry and Gene Coon, write fondly of Coon, Justman describing him as a reliable and creative writer who never missed a deadline. Solow, who continued to work with Coon on other projects after Star Trek ended, writes about the days leading up to his death. Quote, "Friday afternoon, Gene Coon called me from a hospital. His voice was shallow, and he gasped for air as he spoke. 'Herb, Jackie was going to call, but she's at the library getting me some books to read.' He paused. 'It's not too good.' I tried for more information. Gene merely repeated, 'It's not too good.' We agreed I'd visit him Monday and discuss our pilot script order. At 7 o'clock Sunday morning, 6 days after he was examined by his doctor, Gene Coon died in Jackie's arms. The X-rays had shown a lump the size of a grapefruit in his lungs. The original diagnosis of smog-induced bronchitis had turned out to be inoperable cancer. Gene Coon died before the post-cancellation revival of Star Trek really took off. He had been invited to work on Star Trek the Animated Series, but declined and died 2 months before the show premiered in September 1973. He missed out on the rise of the fandom, the conventions, the movies, the spin-offs, everything that his hard work and creativity had helped to make possible. Then again, he also missed having to endure Gene Roddenberry spending the next couple of decades taking sole credit for the whole thing. Here's Herb Solow again from Inside Star Trek on Roddenberry's conduct during Star Trek's resurgence in the 1970s. Quote, "My last conversation with Gene Roddenberry was in 1973, during the ill-fated negotiations with Paramount for him to write and me to produce what would have been the first Star Trek movie. The fact that years later Paramount finally relented and allowed him to produce Star Trek the Motion Picture convinced me that it wasn't the money that caused Gene to negate the all-but-finalized deal. Based on our very close working relationship in the trenches at Desilu, I knew that even though Gene had initiated the discussions, he could not emotionally accept the public knowledge that someone else was producing his movie. The inability to forge the first movie deal wasn't the cause of my major disappointment with Gene. My displeasure grew over the years as he reinvented the origins of Star Trek, further enlarging the Star Trek legend and the Gene Roddenberry myth. While there is no denying that Gene created the root, the core from which the series grew, there were other important contributors to its growth: Gene Coon, Bob Justman, Matt Jeffries, and me. Unfortunately, the credit for our contributions was washed away in the wake of Gene's disinclination to honor them, and by doing so, he assumed their authorship. I would add Dorothy Fontana to that list of important contributors Roddenberry should have acknowledged. Elsewhere in the book, Solow and Justman describe her as one of the most valuable and dependable writers to ever work on Star Trek, but the general point stands. Great man theory is a flawed method for studying and understanding history, even when it's practiced by honest and well-intentioned historians. The great man theory version of the history of Star Trek was manufactured and promoted by the great man himself. That alone should make us dubious of that version of history and of that man's character. Herb Solow and Bob Justman weren't the only Star Trek alumni who were unhappy with how Roddenberry's need to take sole credit for himself erased the work of others, particularly Gene Coon. In his book Star Trek Memories, William Shatner and his ghostwriter Chris Kresge devotes an entire chapter to Coon, titled The Unsung Hero. He writes, quote, "During Coon's tenure on the show, the good-naturedly argumentative relationship between Bones and Spock became wonderfully real, as did the friendship between Kirk and Spock, and the complaining miracle worker characterization of Scotty. With that in mind, although the Star Trek characters were conceived and created by Roddenberry, they really came to life, fully formed and recognizably human, under the direction of Gene Coon. Coon took Roddenberry's characters and made them people, made them a family. Arena, Space Seed, The Devil in the Dark, Errand of Mercy, A Piece of the Action, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, all episodes on which Gene Coon or his pseudonym is a credited writer. Some of the best, or at least most indelible episodes Star Trek ever produced. When you expand the list to include episodes he produced and probably gave uncredited script polishes to, it becomes even more impressive. Shore Leave, The Galileo 7, The Squire of Gothos, This Side of Paradise, Amok Time, The Doomsday Machine, The Trouble with Tribbles, The City on the Edge of Forever, and that is not all of them. Gene Coon grasped what Star Trek was, what Star Trek is, more fully than its creator Gene Roddenberry did. Coon understood that it was a silly, pulpy sci-fi action-adventure show and a show with serious moral and philosophical and political underpinnings. A show that could be fun and entertaining and had something relevant to say about our world and our shared human experience. William Shatner and his ghostwriter, Chris Kresge, put it like this. Quite simply, Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, and Gene Coon made it fly. I couldn't have had somebody else write that for me under my name any better myself. That's why, even though I get it, I don't like to call him the other Gene. To me, he'll always be the superior Gene. Just not, in an ubermensch sort of way. In a, he was a better writer than the other guy named Gene way. That kind of superior Gene. Inoffensive. Except to Gene Roddenberry, I guess, but fuck Gene Roddenberry. Hey folks! Hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are... I had to remake my account. Thanks, I had to remake my account. Joe Hopfield. Thanks, Joe. Brian Robertson. Thanks, Brian. Eliminator. Thanks, Eliminator. Rebecca Williams. Thanks, Rebecca. Jody Freeman. Thanks, Jody. Ricky Strong. Thanks, Ricky. Fox Aches. Thanks, Fox. And now the new channel members. They are Lisa Bobin. Thanks, Lisa. VL Melody 51. Thanks, VL Melody 51. K Schaller 5423. Thanks, K. Patty Cakes KY. Thanks, Patty Cakes. Rob C 1775. Thanks, Rob C. NB Drone. Thanks, NB Drone. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice-monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, we're jumping back into the fictional universe of Star Trek with both feet to take a look at some of the people who live there, how they behave, and maybe, just maybe, what we can learn from them. Here in the real world, it's been an interesting last 10 years. For many of us, this past decade could even be described as traumatic on a cultural level and perhaps also on a personal level. Can Star Trek provide us with any guidance for how we might deal with that? We'll find out in next month's video, which will be on the topic of how Star Trek characters actually deal with trauma. That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.